I was struck. The title of this and the title of the biography, as it turned out, was started with, I was looking back into the books published in the late 19th, early 20th century, the so-called debunkers. You know, they were telling the truth about everything, and everything was pretty negative that they were coming up with. And one man, W.E. Woodward, commented in his biography of Washington that Washington was an ordinary man raised to the highest levels. And the remark was meant to be disparaging, of course. But it struck me as I was working my way through the sources and looking. Washington was very ordinary. He did not have much education, for example, something that he was very sensitive about. He didn't have any foreign languages. The highest mathematics he did was the plane geometry needed for his surveying and the like. And he was certainly not well read in the European or even the British political philosophers of the day and so forth. He had the only formal, and it's stretching things to call it a formal education that he had, was in a so-called Dame school. In other words, a school for very young children run by probably a needy widow or someone like that, but a woman. And that's where he got his basic letters from, and arithmetic and the like and so forth. The rest of the exact place is not really known. And for the rest of it, he just kind of had to shift for himself and was self-educated. So he is, in many respects then, an ordinary man. His talents in most fields were relatively commonplace. He could write clearly, but it certainly was not dramatic and would not stir the patriotic fevers of the patriots or anything like that. What happened is that he takes these commonplace talents and by dint of a number of character traits, the most important of which is self-discipline, he raises them to the level of superior achievement and uses them primarily as we approach it, to the degree of interest or to the degree of discipline and attention to detail and so forth, which it takes to bring all the various parts of an organization so that they work towards the achievement of a goal. And it probably started when he was trying to work up his plantation at Mount Vernon, which he inherited in a kind of offhand way from his older brother, who had gotten it from their father. When the father died when Washington was about 12 years old. And he had two older brothers by his father's first marriage. He was the oldest one by his father's second marriage. And, but the other, Lawrence and Skips, I forget it at this point. But so he's almost a kind of orphan, really, as a young man. There is no one in the Washington clan, and it wasn't very large. And father had died. A couple other men of that generation also had died to push him. Lawrence had been the one who had pushed him. You know, there's a story about how selfish Mrs. Washington's mother was. That correspondent of theirs in Great Britain had arranged things so that George could get a midshipman's berth on one of the larger British vessels. Now this took some doing. But the mother was dead set against it. Dead set. Now, it's never she was somewhat literate, but not much. But at any rate, what she may very well have been thinking of was George did not have the interest, as they called it. In other words, the influence which would push him forward in the Navy. He'd be on his own. And he may either wash out or wind up a half-pay lieutenant or something like that. You know, it was the way the British did things at that time. And so Mrs. Washington wasn't so selfish. She was rather canny. That being said, and not just as an aside, his relationship with his mother is a puzzle. He did not, but he always saw to it that she was taken care of and so forth. And, but nothing more than that. And he actively discouraged her from coming to Mount Vernon to live. She had a farm which was actually his, that he had inherited from his father, and up near Fredericksburg, I believe. Yeah, and she lived there, and one of her other children farmed it for her and so forth as a manager, etc. So she was seen to, okay. But so, you know, in many respects, Washington's a rather ordinary man. And certainly as we look at the young Washington, there's a good many unpleasant character traits, let's say, about him. He's grasping, ambitious, very insecure, and to superiors, and he was often either insubordinate or sometimes even disloyal. For example, Governor Dinwiddie did a number of favors for Washington. And Washington always, no matter whatever particular command he might have under Dinwiddie, Washington just pushed Dinwiddie for more. One of the favorite examples I like, he was with the Virginia Regiment, which by a series of superior officers dying and so forth, he was commanding them. And while he commanded them, a unit surprised a group of Frenchmen and Indians. And in the ensuing musket fight, several of the French and most of the Indians were killed. Well, it happened that one of the Frenchmen had been sent by the Governor General of the French Governor General up in Canada with a message for Governor Dinwiddie to get his men out of there because it was French territory where they were, western Pennsylvania actually, at that point. Well, you see what's happened? That man had diplomatic status. They discovered it only after examining the papers he had and so forth and so on. They had killed, in effect, an ambassador. Okay? Which, you know, is not a very good thing. So, yeah. Washington sends back a report of what was going on. He only had about 40 men there, something like that. It really wasn't a full regiment. Washington sends a letter back. And in the printed version, it's about 8 or 9 pages. It gets to about page 7, and he is given some of the minutiae and so forth. And he mentions, oh, by the way, you know, one of the people we shot was an ambassador. And just drops it right in Dinwiddie's lap. That, okay, what are you going to do about this? You know, but putting it off as long as he could. Another, later on, when he is colonel of the Virginia Regiment, which was a group of soldiers recruited by the colony of Virginia. It wasn't militia. They were soldiers recruited for 2 years, 3 years, something like that, whatever. So it was a cut, it was certainly a substantial cut, really, above a militia regiment or anything like that. And that was what Washington had for 3 years in the early years of the French and Indian War. And he was always sending reports to Dinwiddie. And 2 things that he hit time and time again were the substantial failure of Dinwiddie to give him adequate supplies, and secondly, he wasn't being paid as much as a British officer, and that's not right. All he wanted was his fair share. You know, colonial officers were not equal to British officers. And as a matter of fact, any British officer could, regardless of rank, order an American colonel or an American officer, you know, and regardless of the American officer's rank. And there was a Captain Dagworthy at a fort in, at any rate, it was on the border between Virginia and Maryland. And it was quite convenient to support the Virginians in the western part of the colony. But Washington avoided going there for about a year and a half or so because Dagworthy had been a British officer. He no longer held that commission, but he was actually a militia officer in the service of Maryland. But he claimed to be superior to Washington and tried to order Washington around. So Washington dealt with it in a thoroughly craven way. He just didn't go there. You know, he just didn't go there, even though it was a significant post. It was a significant post, but it ranked him no end that, you know, he wasn't getting his, well, as I said, you know, he wasn't getting his fair share. He wasn't getting his fair share. And it's a continued note that runs through his service to Virginia in the 1740s. Yeah, actually the first one, he's a major of the Fairfax County, appointed to supervise militia and the like. I think he was 19 at the time, something like that. It was a patronage appointment that his brother had arranged for him. And then from that, he had several other positions during, as I say, the 30s, or rather the latter part of the French and Indian War. And he, pardon me, I got a little problem with the order here. Okay, yes. And he actually resigns from Virginia's service in 1754 because they had recast the form of their provincial troops, and instead of a regiment, they had divided them into companies, and Washington was going to be head of one of the companies, which would only be lieutenant colonel or something like that, whatever. He had been Major Washington when he was the ranking officer of the regiment. And so he resigned. He resigned. And he goes off to western Pennsylvania with the Braddock expedition as a volunteer. If you remember, the Braddock expedition was the expedition that was, well, it wasn't really an ambush. The French and substantial force of French officers and the Indians with a sprinkling of French officers came out of the fort that they were approaching. Well, Pittsburgh, but I forget the French name of the fort. Duquesne. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Duquesne. They came out from Duquesne, and they were trotting along to meet the British, who were a good bit closer than they knew. And all of a sudden, I mean, literally, it was one of these things. They come over a hill, and they're facing each other. Neither party was ready at that point. But the French and the Indians, particularly the Indians, recovered sooner than they were mainly provincial troops that were with Washington, although there was a body also of redcoats with them. And that was the battle when it started. And Washington did do really good service there. Braddock didn't and the British officers didn't understand that the Virginians were ready to move against the Indians into the woods, not line up and shoot, but rather move in individually and fight Indian style. When they started to do that, some of the British troops fired on them because they were turning their backs. You know, it seemed as though they were going away. Washington brought some order into it, but by that time they were really in bad shape. So Braddock ordered a retreat and then was shot, critically wounded. He died later that day. Washington did a good bit of the work in organizing what was left of the French and the Virginia troops and get them back safely into British-held area. So, you know, he had abilities, and when given the opportunity, could really shine. But unfortunately, of course, the man who was ready to really testify for him was dead. General Braddock. And a number of the British officers wrote letters to Dinwiddie and even to I think it was Lord Loudon at that time, was the British commander-in-chief in North America, of this young officer and how well he had done. So he goes back and the Virginia regiment is reconstituted and he takes off and for the next few years acts as in that light and gets a good bit of credence there, but not much more than that. And in 1759, remember the 7 Years' War in 1763, 1759 he resigns his commission and marries Martha. And you know, about that there's a good bit of, well, she was a wealthy woman. Yes, she was. She was a very wealthy woman. She was possibly one of the richest people in, pardon me, in Virginia at that time. Her husband had died without making a will, and consequently, she received 1/3 of his estate outright, and it wasn't a widow's third, you know. And she had 2 children, a daughter and a son, and they received the other 2/3. So they were all rather wealthy. But she certainly needed somebody to run the estate. She needed somebody to manage things. And whether it was a marriage of true love or not, I don't know how to put it. But they were married for 40 years, and it was ended only when Washington died in 1799. And there was never also any imputation of any wrongdoing or fiddling around by Washington, either as a planter or the general. And just one other thing, it's not particularly important, but you know, she was a very attractive woman, and most of the references to her mention that. You know, with the pictures we have of her, she's relatively old. She's got that stupid little cap on her face. You know, it was fashion for the time.
Was she older than George?
No, I don't believe so. No. If she was, it wasn't much. It certainly wasn't much. And so both of them gained by the wedding. She got somebody who managed the estate very well, really. And he was also the manager for the 2 children. And the daughter was always sick. Whether it was epilepsy or not, it's awfully difficult to tell from the 18th century. Medical notes are not particularly good. But she dies when she's about 15 or 16. And she leaves her estate to her stepfather. And it had gained something like 1/3 in the 5 or 6 years he had run it. So he was a very good money manager. And, well, of course, now it was his. Her son was not very useful. let's say. He couldn't discipline himself to education or anything like that. He wanted to go in the Army. She was very fearful about what might happen to him if he goes into the Army. So she would never allow him to take a commission during the War for Independence or anything like that. But she does give him permission to go to the camp at Yorktown in 1781 and serve as a kind of unpaid aide to his stepfather. He goes, and what happens, of course, he catches what they call camp fever, typhoid, and dies. He was married very much against their will. He's kind of run off, and at 17 or something like that. And they had 2 young kids. One's an infant, the other's a kind of a toddler or something like that. And so Washington brings them in, and actually their mother gives them to George and Martha. Now that, that sounds kind of callous and so forth. It was what they did. It was what they did. Children were often orphaned like that, or semi-orphaned, something like that. And obviously, the situation was going to be a good bit more stable at Mount Vernon for the children. And so they, both of them, lived to adulthood. And that's Bushrod, I believe. Yeah, Bushrod. I don't know where they got that name, but Bushrod Washington was one of the Supreme Court justices. He was a very talented lawyer, and pretty he has Mount Vernon for after George dies. I'm pretty sure Bushrod holds it for a while, but there was a dispute, and then so. Okay, so George has resigned from the military service after he marries, and that seems to be about the end of it. But, and this is one of the unpleasant traits of his character. When the war ends, he had intervened with Dinwiddie and also with the Lord Fauquier, who had succeeded Dinwiddie, to issue a land bounty for the old Virginia regiment. And every man in it could get 5,000 acres. And so at the end of the war, Washington busies himself in making certain, he's in the Burgesses by now, of making sure that that is honored. And when it is honored, he takes a very sizable portion of that land. Now, the way in which the bounty was expressed clearly was for the enlisted men. He was not entitled to that. But nobody said anything. Kind of, well, something like, I guess, subalterns or with a, when the boss is acting up or something like that, choose simply not to say anything. And so he got the major portion of it. So, okay, directly, and then he also sent agents around to buy the shares of men who didn't want to take them up, because they were out along the Ohio, which was not a particularly safe place as far as Indian action was concerned at that point. So, clearly he was wrong in taking the share directly. The buying the shares of the other men, as long as he paid for them, that was, paid a fair price. That there was nothing wrong with that. Although obviously, is pressure being applied or something like that? We don't know. We don't know. There was also another bounty to, I forget what, 25,000 acres, something like that, whatever. It was substantial to anyone, any officer who served until the end of the war. Well, remember, he retired, he resigned in '59, but he takes it. He takes it. Yeah, no, I happen to think, taking the land that was for the enlisted men, that wasn't very nice at all. How legal, moral, I don't know, make up your own mind about it. It certainly was questionable because every acre he took was an acre that was not available for distribution to the enlisted men. Okay. The second one, the land bounty, came out of the West. All that land in the West, that was not part of any specific colony or anything like that. In other words, we're talking practically everything between the Ohio and the Mississippi. If he took some of that, so what? Nobody was a loser for that. But he did have greed, really. 33,000 acres out of what had been intended for the enlisted men. 33,000 acres. And another thing about that acreage was much of it, too much of it, was in bottomland along the river. There were restrictions. You couldn't take, like, say, a mile back and 100 miles long. Now, it had to be more like a mile or two on the river, back up into the backcountry. That was the way the land was to be distributed. So nobody got an outlandish portion of the most attractive land. The most attractive land. So he's grasping, insecure, looking for other provincial appointments from Virginia and the like and so forth. Okay. As I said, he's not a particularly attractive person. But when he comes back into public notice in the early 70s, he was a little late in coming into activity on behalf of those who were objecting to British policy. It's finally only with the tax which resulted in the Tea Parties and that one, and he got really upset about that, and he put together a list of commodities which the colony's people would promise not to consume, that they were imported from Great Britain, so that was putting the screws on Britain. And he goes next door to his neighbor, George Mason, and gives him, says, tell me what you think of this. And George comes back a couple days later. George was head of the group of Virginians who were trying to organize the Virginia boycott of exactly these things, mostly. I mean, I think there were a few. But Washington didn't have an idea. That's how far off the loop he was at that point. But once he is told, he settles to and begins to organize the opposition to the British effort. During this period also, he's in command of the militia of Fairfax County, where he has been in the, it's getting warm in here, where he has been a member of the House of Burgesses since I think 60 or 63, whatever. He's defeated the first time he stands for election, and it turns out he hadn't treated the voters enough. You had to go. How many miles to go to vote? And you had to, voting in those days was viva voce. You went up, the sheriff was there. The sheriff asked for your name. Okay, you're in the book. How do you vote? And generally speaking, the candidates were on either side there. Okay. And thank you, Mr. Smith. I treasure that vote, and so forth. I mean, that was the way they did it. And sometimes the big people, often enough, did not get elected. So it was apparently democratic enough. So he's in the Burgesses through the 50s. but not, you know, particularly, pardon me, not particularly active. He was I don't think there's any record of him ever speaking in the Burgesses. I mean, they had committees, and he probably worked there and so forth, but he didn't speak. He didn't speak. And throughout his public career, he intensely disliked public speaking and did whatever he could to avoid it. And even, pardon me, even when he was in the Continental Congress, he also did not speak. And yet, you know, at the organization, when the Congress moves towards the Declaration of Independence, and after that document had been they organize, or they don't organize it, that's the problem. They authorize, is what I should have said, the enlistment of so many men for 1 year enlistments, whatever, something, I forget. They were never more than 1 year for the first couple years of the war. But, and appoint Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the forces enlisted in the service of the Continental Congress. When Washington accepted the position, he was the only person enlisted in the service of the Continental Congress. He had a whole, you know, army to as much as he could assist, raise, but also to organize and the like and so forth. He got the job. He had the military background, okay? But just as important was the fact that he was from Virginia. And right now, the only people who were fighting were the New England militia gathered around Boston. The encounter in Lexington, the British go back. Then they're besieged in Boston. Boston at that time, don't look at a map today, but at that time, Boston was virtually an island. It was connected to the mainland by a thin strip, which could be flooded at high tide. So the only way for any body of men to try to take the place or anything like that would be by an amphibious attempt. And Washington was continuously pushing for one of those. Thank goodness they didn't do it, because they would have been murdered. The British would have been waiting for them. The siege was quite effective. I mean, and they did make, by means of artillery on Dorchester Heights and other places, it very uncomfortable for the British in Boston. They do leave in March of 1776. Pardon?
I think it would have been 1776.
76? Okay, yeah, I'm trying to remember, does it come to be, no, it has to come, yeah. So,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah. They spent you know, the spring and early summer down. The British kind of moved to New York.
Not until they leave for the benefit of modern Boston on the 17th of March. They leave. And that's the Irish found that it was a holiday when they came. You know, evacuation day. Yeah. And call it Patriots Day now, I believe.
No, Patriots Day, the 19th of April.
Oh, okay, with okay, yeah. So what's it called?
Evacuation Day.
Still, okay. I've never tried to ignore Boston.
Yeah, well, I lived up there for a while.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, we all have served our time. So, in any event, That was handled rather well. That was handled rather well, the siege around there and so forth. And, but of course, you know, the lack of organization is seen clearly. Washington asked, for example, how much powder do we have? And so about a week and a half later, the officer put in charge of it comes in, and well, quite a substantial sum. I mean, Washington was very pleased. They really had plenty. And about 3 weeks later, he finds out what the officer had reported was all of the powder that had come forth from the colonies. They didn't think to count that which had been expended. You know? Yeah. So they had about a third of what they had reported. You know, and it was that kind of a situation. They are somewhat better when they moved down to New York. The British went up to Halifax and reorganized themselves. And in the summer of 1777, they come down to 6. Okay, yeah, I wanted to say 6, but it seemed to me it took a while. But no, right, of course, yeah, 1776, yeah. They moved down. By that time, of course, Washington had done what he could to take care of New York and the like. Eventually, in a matter of a couple months, they're forced to flee. The British, remember, had command of the sea, quote and unquote, around Manhattan. And the Continentals didn't have any navy of any sort yet. And it would take a while before even what they do get begins to move out and basically act as privateers. So the events around New York were not particularly encouraging. In several cases, the troops simply broke and ran when they saw the British. There was one good episode in Harlem as the Americans were evacuating up Manhattan Island and being chased by the British. And one of the British units, the bugler was told to use, I forget the name of it, but it's what they used in fox hunting when the fox was spotted. You know, they go, okay, go off. Come on, here. There's the fox. And it was across 125th Street was a kind of a gully. And the Continentals were north, the British were south. And when the Continentals heard that, and they weren't all Continentals, a number of them were provincial troops or you know, state militia and the like, so forth and so on. I'm not sure how many Continental regiments there had been at that point, enlisted at that point. At any rate, the Americans get their dander up. And for that time, it was an extraordinary exchange that they had with the British. Skirmishes, really. You know, nobody got up in a line and shot at each other and so forth and so on. The Americans were basically sniping at the British were sniping at the Americans as well as they could. But the militia, the American troops, whatever level they were, stayed and fought for at least an hour or two, something like that. And so at that point, that was pretty good. At that point, that was pretty good that they could do that. They then continue their retreat up, and a number of them go into Westchester County. A number also are put in a fort which Washington had ordered along the Hudson, below where the George Washington Bridge is now, more or less Morningside Heights and so forth, along there. It was quite extensive, and there was a lot of munitions, powder and shot there. Also weapons, and I forget, oh, they called it Fort Washington, that's right, sure, that's why it's Washington Heights now, yeah. And Washington dilly-dallied about evacuating those men. Nathaniel Greene, who was a Quaker from Rhode Island, turning into one of his more effective generals, argued with him about get them out of there, get them out of there. Washington just couldn't, for whatever reason, bring himself to do that. He goes to the other side, and of course Fort Lee is there. As you go over the George Washington Bridge, if you look to your left, or your right, if you look to your left, said he, holding his right hand up. Yeah, okay. Yeah, if you look to your right, you see a rather high escarpment of the rock and the like. That was where Fort Lee was. That was where Fort Lee was. And that what they hoped to do was deny the Hudson to the British. Okay? And that was probably why Washington didn't want to take those troops out. Well, of course, all of a sudden, they're attacked. The troops on the New York side of the river, and within a very short period of time, forced to surrender. And it wasn't, the men, the loss was substantial. It was very substantial in terms of weapons and powder. You know, he had left much too much there. And the mistakes that he did make, he was learning. He was obviously learning. And it was something that I forget what occasion it was, but he wrote a letter to Greene and whatever it was, but he mentions that and how badly he felt about it. And this was like 4 years later or something like that. You know. So, but he's also learning. And you can see in any number of ways the attention that he begins to pay to the details which he has discovered are so very important. He had already brought a good bit of improvement to Mount Vernon, which had been neglected because it was paid managers who had been looking after the place while he was out in western Pennsylvania, and well, his older brother who willed the place to him. Actually, he didn't. He willed it to his wife, and Washington got it from Lawrence's wife. So, but at any rate, he did get Mount Vernon. And he begins to show in these early years of the war the self-discipline, character trait in which he had always been a hard worker, but here applying himself to a good bit of what was really drudgery. The writing of letters, for example. I don't know how many, I think it's a couple thousand letters that he writes during the war to the Congress, to the governors, to his general, so forth, all of this, trying to get the material that he needs, get the men that he needs, convince the generals to do what get their units in order, and so forth and so on. A good bit is accomplished, and yeah, there's people like Steuben or Stuyvesant, however, George Friedrich von whatever. He may even have been a real baron, we don't know. He very likely was not, but he was an excellent drill master. And he taught the Continental troops in Valley Forge. He taught them the proper drill. He taught them the proper drill. And more important than the troops, their officers. Their officers. I mean, the officers were brought in and that was it. They began to be trained by doing, okay? But Stuyvesant had really brought a remarkable improvement. The Battle of Monmouth is the summer of 1778, when they're coming out of the, that's the right year, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah. I don't know why I had my doubts there. I was primarily interested in political history, as it shows, I think. But at any rate, The Battle of Monmouth. The American troops, the Continental troops, stand up for the best that the British had in North America at Monmouth. And in a very difficult situation, both physically or terrain-wise, there was a lot of marshy land there and the like, and easy movement was confined because you couldn't always walk here. It was marshy. You had to walk where the strong land, where the useful land was. And they did a good job. It was a beastly hot day, more or less like today. And remember, they're fighting with woolen clothes often. The uniforms that they had are heavy clothes and the like. And there's a number. I'm not going to try and give it because it obviously, I do not remember it specifically, but of the men who died of heat exhaustion that day. And both sides, of course. Indeed, the British had better uniforms. More uniform, in other words. They probably more of them died than the Americans. So he was putting things together. You wonder sometimes where this improvement comes from or that. We have Steuben. And since they were showing exactly what Steuben had taught them, and obviously the improvement is coming through him. But Washington had supported him. A lot of the American generals were very unhappy with this Kraut getting the, getting that appointment and so forth. Inspector General of the Army. Inspector General of the Army. But Washington stuck with him. Washington stuck with him. And it paid off. It paid off. And during all of this time, the unremitting attention to detail and the like. He continually improved during the war. And let's say I have a better statement of what I want to say here. So let me. Yeah, I'm sorry, I had it, and in any event, Washington was not a particularly good battlefield general. He was more a general on the model of Eisenhower. People often think of generals as useful only if they're like Patton or somebody like that. No, he was more or less kind of the administrative general, and which he did very well. The improvements, time and time again, are in the Continental Forces are due to him, and that attention that he paid. He is very good at giving credit where credit was due, as he did with, for example, Greene. Greene was pushed on up the line after being right at Fort Washington instead of what George had wanted to do, and others are cashiered out of the Army one way or another. And this is the kind of thing that doesn't show. You can't, it shows in the results, but it can't be the handling of what he did at Princeton. Every once in a while, at Princeton, a British force comes out of it's not there anymore, but a kind of thicket, perhaps even a forest. It's the example, the description of it differs. But there's Continentals who are just getting themselves organized. And Washington rides down between the two bodies as the British are starting to organize themselves to fire. And whipping the Continentals or state, I don't know exactly what units they were, but he gets them into order. And at risk of his own life. I mean, the British do start firing, and somehow or other he rides back through it and was not touched. Was not touched. He was lucky. He was lucky. That was it. But and the Americans fight rather well at that. Remember, that's the battle where they have come over to the New York side after the after the ambush, not ambush, but after the raid, Trenton. And that was all the Americans wanted to do, raid, get supplies, kill as many Hessians as they could, and then get back. And they did a good job of it. But the important thing was that the British were very confident that they had licked them. And they really didn't expect to see them again. And all of a sudden, there they are. First they get the Hessians on the 25th. And then several days later, the series of battles, which generally go in as the Battle of Princeton and so forth. And I think the book about Washington's Crossing, the author is James, one of you, who?
Not Fisher.
Yeah, Fisher, James Fisher, yeah. Yeah, James Hackett Fisher, yeah. He has a note there in that book about the fighting on the 2nd and 3rd of January. The force of Continentals goes up, basically up Route 1, and contacts the British and begins to retreat. It's a force under a Colonel Edward Hand. And they come back and pausing to...
I need to do something. I hate to do this to us, but we have to be out around at 9. So we're...
It's 9 o'clock.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. There were more, and anyway, there were more casualties on the American side that day than occurred on the day of the raid on the Hessians and so forth. It was a very significant action, and the British suffered badly too. Okay, I'm sorry, this could have been better organized, but...
well, we appreciate it, don't worry
well,
about that.
yeah, but it took me, what? I left at 3 o'clock to get down here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it took about 3.5 hours, something like that. Partly because the Garden State Parkway wandered. No, I lost it.
Awesome.
No,
I can't.
Good.
Don't we have all driven that Garden State Parkway, and it has also